Hello and welcome to Connecting Society, a podcast about how everyday data can shape our lives. I'm Shada Kashef, Senior Public Engagement Manager for Administrative Data Research UK, or ADR UK to me and you.
And I'm Mark Green, Professor of Health Geography at the University of Liverpool. We are your co-hosts and guides around the wonders of administrative data or data we don't judge.
In this podcast, we're exploring all the different ways in which the information that's collected about our everyday lives, from our interactions with health services, our voting behaviours, police and crime reporting, educational achievements, and more, is used by researchers and policymakers to make better decisions to support society and make the world a better place.
So, Shada, today we're talking about evaluation. And I've got a little quote to kind of get us in the spirit of things. It's from a very famous doctor as well. So, it has that academic tone to it.
Is it Dr. Seuss?
I'm afraid not, no. I'll go with the quote and you'll see if you know who said this. People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect. But actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. That's Doctor Who.
Oh, I like that. I've never watched Doctor Who.
That's okay. I think it's quite a good quote because it actually gets to the crux of what we're going to talk about today, which is about how evaluation isn't quite so simple. And actually, we need to think about the complexity of how things operate. And actually moving towards that kind of complex thinking can help us really start to interrogate whether certain policies or interventions worked or didn't work.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, exactly. And our guest today argues that the way we think about evaluations is old-fashioned and can even be harmful. So, is he right? Check out our interview to find out more. Evaluation is often seen as a neutral and technical process. On the surface, it can look like you're collecting data, measuring outcomes, and judging whether a policy or a program worked. But what if the way we evaluate is shaping and sometimes even harming the very systems and communities we're trying to improve? Well, that's what we're diving into today. Our guest is Dr. Luke Roberts, a complexity theorist and evaluator who argues that traditional approaches to evaluation do not account for the complex adaptive systems that underpin society. He argues that change doesn't happen in neat linear ways, yet evaluation methods often impose fixed timelines, rigid metrics, and narrow perspectives that can miss what really matters. In this episode, we'll explore Luke's provocative claim that evaluation can be a violent act, what that means in practice, and how we can rethink evaluation as an ecosystem. Hi, Luke. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thank you, Shada. That was a lovely introduction, so I'm very excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have you. So, last year, you delivered a keynote at the UK Evaluation Society's conference in Glasgow. And as part of your speech, you said that evaluation is a potentially violent act. Unsurprisingly, that statement was met with gasps from the audience. So, what do you actually mean when you say evaluation can be violent?
So let me premise the statement. So I asked everyone in the audience, first of all, do you believe we live in a complex world? And so in a complex world, things are interconnected, interdependent. There are ambiguities and there are relationships that occur. And so if we're saying that violence occurs through evaluation, then my argument was, firstly, we need a definition of violence that captures what the phenomena we're interested in. And I've really thought very hard about that definition before I presented it to the audience. And so I argue that violence is the intentional or avoidable non-consensual act that inflicts harm or significantly impedes the fulfillment of an individual, group's or system's basic needs. And so often when people talk about violence, we tend to talk about the forms of violence, the acts of violence, rather than what violence is. So I was kind of thinking through based on my kind of 20 years experience looking in the field of conflict resolution and peace studies, well, when we go to evaluate particular types of programs or initiatives or policies, do we recognize firstly that the systems that we're evaluating could be violent, i.e. they enact violence on people and communities? And secondly, when evaluators seek to do an evaluation, do they recognize that they could be part of a violent system, and B, that form of evaluation that reduces complexity, stops individuals, groups or systems fulfilling their basic needs as well? So that's where I positioned myself, that there is evaluation as a violent act.
That's really interesting. And I'm sure a lot of evaluators I'm sure they do it in the best of intentions. So it's probably initially like quite shocking to hear that. But I'd love to unpack that just a little bit more. So you are talking about violent systems. My head is just going towards like systematic inequality, that kind of thing. Is that what you're thinking, or is it something else?
It's probably everything's connected in complexity. But I'll give an example. So years ago, I worked in the prison system. And what I saw wasn't just that there were conflicts between prison officers and prisoners, prisoners and prisoners. It was the way in which policy was being made that suddenly started to occur to me that that is quite a violent enactment on that system. So you have short-termism, you have people rushing around trying to fulfill things with targets that are under-resourced. So again, we're stopping the system meeting its basic needs to create a quality of care and experience that reduces what is claimed to be preventing victims of crime and recidivism. But actually, the way in which policymakers were enacting their policies meant that the system became more violent because it dehumanised not just the prisoners, but it also dehumanised the staff and the management through that kind of Victorian era audit tick box exercises. So what you end up with is people saying like, let's evaluate a particular initiative based off of outputs and outcomes, but not recognising that the experience of everybody in that system is harm because of the violence that's being enacted by the system. And the evaluators may be colluding or being co-opted by that system. Hence, evaluation is a violent act.
Unknowingly colluding, presumably.
You can mitigate it if you want, but I think sometimes people absolutely know that when we do this kind of reductionist stance around complex relationships and systems, that we've been commissioned to do the classic before and after, here's the outputs of it, but we don't explore the kind of temporal violence of, well, what was before the before and what happens after the after. And so there's a real risk that we can intentionally collude by our methodologies to say, like, look, over this period of time, this is what happens. But actually, the community has been waiting for 6 years for this particular intervention to come into place. And the funding's just been pulled because the commissioner goes, like, actually, there wasn't enough data because the evaluation wasn't 36 months, it was really 18 because it took 6 months to get up and running. All of those things combine in a way that means that sometimes we are co-opted, but other times we are absolutely colluding with the violence of evaluation.
I think that example is actually really helpful in us sort of grounding this conversation in like the real world. So let's take it a little bit further. You work with complex adaptive systems. It's quite a mouthful. So what makes these systems fundamentally different from how evaluation treats them?
So if we think of two different types of systems, so there are complicated systems which are basically linear and are sequential or moving parallel to produce a particular type of outcome. And I think that's probably the standard kind of mental model most people have of change. I think the difference is within complex adaptive systems, they are able to self-organise in ways we don't expect, i.e. they can be resilient or they can be defensive to the changes we're thinking about. They also have the ability to, and the most important part of a complex adaptive system is this idea of emergence. They can bring about new features or behaviours that are system-wide, but aren't necessarily dependent on the individuals in that system. And so that means that when we think about things like theories of change, theory of change is a linear model for a linear system. We want to put something in that tells us outputs, impact, outcomes, etc., which is great. But when you're dealing with complexity, theories of change then becomes a violent form of evaluation, because it now seeks to reduce complexity to outputs and outcomes, and it hides emergence in there. And so the ability for the system to learn is ignored because we're interested in only the outputs and outcomes of the system at that particular moment in time. Hence, we are back to evaluation as violence.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. Right, so you're accounting for the complexity of life, essentially, and trying to package it into something that isn't doing its due diligence to reality is just not quite working. Okay, so some of our listeners might be thinking, okay, yeah, that makes sense, but is this realistic? So we work in the public sector. I'm very familiar with the theory of change, and public sector budgets are being squeezed. So is it possible for evaluation to take the complex approach that you're describing within a system like ours, like in the public sector? What can we do to try and adopt what you're suggesting?
I think if you're working in the public sector, you're working in complexity from the very beginning. And so because you've got multiple actors in multiple networks seeking to bring about benefits and change, and yet sometimes those services or the offers do not meet the mark by a long way. And so I think even in what that first statement was, like, budgets are squeezed, well, how often is that acknowledged in the evaluation? So from the very beginning, we're saying, like, evaluators are not neutral. We have positionality, and we can create the illusion of objectivity. But the moment you enter a system, you are part of that system. And so I think there's that ability to say, what we're commissioned for is, if we're looking at something across, like, for example, health benefits, like there's a lot of thinking about health as place at the moment. And so, well, what is the money that goes into that, and what was the money that were going before? What would be the money that would actually meet the needs of that system to address health inequality? So already we're starting to look at the complexity of the movement of money through the system before we've even got to the intervention. And the important question for me, which I'm always fascinated by, is like, and if you're successful, how do you sustain it? And so the question then for the evaluator becomes back to, over what time do we think change is occurring? Not just the policy evaluation windows that we're trying to meet. Because I think the biggest danger, in my experience many moons ago working in local authority, was so many initiatives were thrown at communities that you could see community fatigue. And the thing that started to become a splinter in my mind was, well, what happens when these things go? We're creating dependency on community for these things to happen, and yet funding can be pulled at any time, which makes it even harder for the next intervention, initiative, evaluation to come along, because we seem to assume, again, we reduce memory in systems into, like, these are benign systems where you can just put things in and out without people remembering what went before and why would they want to participate again. So again, I think we're back to, in the public sector, probably all of this sounds very familiar, but do our evaluative methodologies, methods and tools allow us to engage with complexity that feels much more realistic and hopeful for the people conducting those types of changes?
Yeah. I want to take it back to something you said earlier when you were talking about the example in the prisons. You mentioned how I think what I heard was that it was really important to listen to the prisoner experience and the staff experience. And I work in public engagement, so lived experience and embedding lived experience meaningfully into data research is my bread and butter, basically. So I really loved hearing that, and I want to hear a bit more about that. So how do you see the role of people with lived experience in evaluation? You kind of already sort of alluded to it, but give us a bit more detail. And do you have any examples of how it can change the findings or impact evaluation?
So I'd be careful with my language, because I see impact as a violent term. as well.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
so,
My
but like
intentions are
it's,
good, I swear.
no, I believe you. But again, like that's how the violence creeps in. Like there's a power dynamic that's always hidden. And so when I'm saying that there's a violence of evaluation, we have to look at our language um, in particular. So when we're thinking about engagement, one of the things that I'm really anxious about is tokenism in participation. And I think one of the things that concerns me sometimes is when we talk about lived experience, in what system are we saying that is of value? Because people occupy multiple systems. So again, is there the risk of reductionism? Like, well, you've got lived experience in the prison system, so I totally ignore your lived experience in the healthcare system. So we can miss these interconnections that occur, I think is really important. But also the risk with kind of lived experiences, it tells me where you've been and where you are, but not necessarily the potential for change in that system as well. And so there's an opportunity to say, particularly in very violent and harmful systems, do we have people who are coming to those systems seeking change, and what are the conditions of imagination we can create to allow those stakeholders in that or actors in that system to be able to say, what could a future system be, and could you imagine yourself being in there as well? So from my perspective, it's really important to hear the lived experience, but also to look at, well, where's the creative, i.e. emergent opportunities in the system? Because in some systems, people are traumatized, they are tired, they're fatigued. I was talking to someone who's in the NHS last week who said, like, we're on our like eighth, restructure. Like the benefits of the system haven't been produced, but we keep moving people around in their roles. That is a form of violence. And then we're saying now go engage with networks and communities to talk about change when they're not in the place to be able to do that. So again, we've just got to be so mindful about when we say you've got lived experience of what in which system.
I do a lot of my engagement with intermediaries, some really excellent people from the non-for-profit sector and the charity sector. And sometimes I'm able to be lucky enough to speak to people who have that direct lived experience, and I completely agree. I mean, we are not just our health condition or our experience of whatever that is, whatever it is that's on the topic. And I did an exercise with our researchers once where I asked them to define themselves as something other than a researcher, so that they can sort of think about that as well. But when I have spoken to people with direct lived experience, like care experience young people is a good example. I know that is an area you're very interested in too. I was really struck by how, from their view, they could see, for example, the state is my parent. And when I compare myself to my peers, my peers get to live at home after 18 if they need to, and they continue to get that parental support. And if I could reform the system, it would be, looking like this, for example, rather than that. And so, yeah, I guess sort of what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of pressure on them to suggest ways of change, but without the ability to actually enact it, or maybe that's not quite right. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Of course. So I think there's kind of several things in what you've just said. So firstly, I think there's a real risk that the people who have experience of the systems are then asked to solve the problems of the system without resources
exactly.
or energy.
That's where I'm getting at. Yeah.
Which is then, and again, as an evaluator, are we at risk of tokenism? Back to that, and I've fallen into that trap where I've had amazing conversations with young people about how a system can change, and then when I've taken it to management or the contract has ended suddenly, all of that knowledge and wisdom just gets lost, kind of. And I'm like, wow, I set them up to fail because I didn't check was there sustainability in the conversations I was having. So I'm acutely mindful that is a form of violence that creates the fatigue that I'm talking about. I think the other thing to say is that particularly in systems where there is lots of conflict, trauma and challenge, it can be very hard to be imaginative about new ways of being in the world. That the system can change and be very different to what's gone before. And I think sometimes the risk is people with lived experience where they don't meet some kind of space to imagine and be given the energy and the psychological safety to do that imagining. It means you kind of end up with like incremental, like, well, we could change this and we could do a little bit here, rather than actually this whole system needs to go. And what would an entirely new system of care based off of empathy and aspiration look like? That then leads you to some radically different solutions that need to come about. And again, who's going to own that and who's going to have that space to say we can actually have a very different system to the one we've got now? And I think that's the hardest thing sometimes. The systems that we're in create these quite narrow perceptions of reality, and we can get boxed into those worldviews. So one of the things that interested me when I was doing the work around care leavers was this metaphor of the cliff edge. Like lots of professionals keep on talking about, there's this cliff edge when they turn 18. And I had to say in the end, like, if you all know this, like, why don't you stop them going off the cliff edge? And everyone went, but that's not what my service is geared towards. And that's the moment the system becomes its violent self, because the way in which things are commissioned, measured, and enabled means that everyone can be really good at their bit of the system, and yet the system produces these violent experiences for young people. And so it's again how we look at the way in which we can use data, we can use methods to call those things out and say, actually, it doesn't matter if you wanted to put in a really good CBT intervention. No one is addressing the moment of harm in that system, which is the cliff edge. So what are the new ways of thinking that need to occur? Because you can't just put that on young people. They are living that experience, finding that experience, and only recognising it post that moment. That's not fair on them, and it's not fair on their futures as well.
Yeah, I completely hear that. All right, well, I could talk to you all day. I can see we're pretty much out of time, but I'm going to get in trouble from my producers for this, but I'm just going to throw one more question at you, because we did discuss previously when we were having a chat off the pod that so many of these conversations feel so doom and gloom, and it's nice to end on a hopeful note. So I'm going to throw it to you. Can you close us off with a hopeful note? If evaluation was designed as an ecosystem, what could it enable?
Well, I think just simply that. Like, if it was designed as an ecosystem, it will value diversity, relationship, interconnection. And so I think we are at a kind of like a very hopeful moment where if we know that some of these things feel really inadequate for the way in which society is becoming more complex with more challenges, then I think it is really about how we can step up to those challenges. And like, I think there are new forms of evaluation to come. They're actually able to engage and meet complexity. But it just means that there's the challenge of how do we deal with the legacy issue of this violent forms of evaluation that commissioners, governments, people feel very comfortable with, like, here's the impact, here's the outcome. How do we help them recognise that the very things that they're trying to change aren't dependent on those old models? And then I think I'm so optimistic always about the creativity and opportunities, particularly for newer, younger evaluators, to really push the boat out and kind of like, we can think of different ways, particularly in the world of AI, where we could really engage with complexity and big data sets in new and novel ways. And that can really make a difference and benefit society.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Luke. This has been such an interesting conversation. And we're back in the studio. Mark, how did you find that conversation?
Well, I was going to say it's all a bit complicated, isn't it? But I know that you say that to complex systems people and it'll upset them because they very much say that, something can be complicated and it can be complex, but they're very different things. Personally, though, Shader, where was the admin data talk? I was expecting more about how admin data fitted into all of this. And it was, so what do you think about that?
I know, you're right. There was just too much to talk about. But I'm really glad that you brought that up, because you are our resident admin data specialist, Professor Mark Green. Can you tell us a little bit about how you use evaluations in your work?
All right. Well, I don't like it when you throw it back onto me. That's very unfair. I think that what we learned today on the podcast is that we need to be reevaluating how we use administrative data if we're going to work within this kind of complex systems environment. So a good way of thinking about this is, do we have perfect data to evaluate the question that we're trying to evaluate? And I think sometimes with administrative data, we focus on what we have access to and what's available, not whether it's right or whether it's really getting at what we're trying to understand. And then we're kind of mistaking sometimes what can we measure rather than what is meaningful. So maybe taking that time to slow down and thinking about how administrative data is reasonable, how it fits into the questions we're asking, and what additional data that we might need to collect to supplement what we can get through administrative data.
Yeah, or even understanding the limitations if you can't sort of collect additional data. I really like what you've said just there. I think it speaks really true to what Luke was saying about the like holistic approach and engaging lots of different people who are involved in the outcome of the project. And yeah, I mean, I completely agree. So great. Thanks for bringing it back to admin data, Mark.
Always.
Fantastic. Well, that's everything from today's episode. Thank you for listening and watching.
Until next time, stay curious about how your everyday data might shape society.